You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 10,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I learned from studying a case that should terrify every person of faith. In 1634, a priest named Urbain Grandier was burned alive for making a pact with demons. The evidence? A document signed by Lucifer himself. This isn't folklore. This actually happened. And what I discovered about that case changed everything I believed about good, evil, and the price of ambition. I'm a religious historian, former seminary student. For 5 years, I researched the Loudun possessions in a cluttered university office in Paris, surrounded by books on demonology, witch trials, medieval theology. What started as academic curiosity became an obsession that cost me my faith, my marriage, and nearly my sanity. Let me tell you about Urbain Grandier and what happened to me when I looked too closely at his story. But I need to start at the beginning, because the details matter. The small moments matter. They're what open the door. The year was 1617. The walled town of Loudun in Poitou stood caught between Catholic and Protestant tensions, a powder keg of religious hatred, waiting for a spark. The town itself was unremarkable. A collection of stone buildings and narrow streets clustered around several churches. But it sat at the edge of Huguenot territory, making it strategically valuable and spiritually contested. Into this volatile situation came Urbain Grandier, appointed priest of Saint-Pierre-du-Marche at just 27 years old. By all accounts, he was brilliant. Educated at the Jesuit college in Bordeaux, tall and handsome with dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense, he possessed a natural gift for oratory that could move entire congregations to tears. His sermons didn't just fill the church, they transformed it into something electric. Women wept openly at his words. Men left feeling both inspired and somehow inadequate. Even his critics admitted he had a quality they couldn't define, a magnetism that drew people to him like moths to flame. Within months, he was also appointed canon of the Sainte Croix Collegiate Church. 2 prestigious positions for someone so young bred immediate resentment among the local clergy, who'd spent decades climbing hierarchies. He seemed to ascend effortlessly. But Grandier had 3 fatal flaws that would ultimately destroy him. Pride that bordered on arrogance, ambition that recognized no boundaries, and an insatiable appetite for women that he made almost no effort to hide. He moved through Loudun like a man who believed himself untouchable, and for years that belief seemed justified. He was too clever, too well connected, too charismatic to be brought down by the same rules that governed ordinary priests. In 1629, that delusion began to crack. Grandier started an affair with Philippa Trinquant, the young daughter of Louis Trinquant, who served as the king's prosecutor in Loudun and had been one of Grandier's closest friends and supporters. The affair was reckless even by Grandier's standards. Philippa was barely 18, sheltered and devout. When she became pregnant, the scandal ripped through Loudun's social fabric like fire through dry wood. Trinquant was publicly humiliated. His daughter's reputation was destroyed. His friendship with Grandier transformed overnight into a hatred so intense it became the defining feature of his remaining years. But Trinquant wasn't alone in his fury. Other clergy had been watching Grandier's rise with growing jealousy. Canon Jean Mignon, a mediocre priest whose sermons emptied churches rather than filled them. Father Pierre Mounier, whose bitterness at being overlooked for advancement had curdled into something toxic. Father Pierre Barrault, who'd been passed over for one of the positions given to Grandier. These men began meeting in secret, plotting in shadows, attempting to bring formal charges of immorality against Grandier in 1630. The trial should have destroyed him. Multiple witnesses testified to his affairs, his arrogance, his open contempt for clerical celibacy, but Grandier defended himself with such brilliance, such rhetorical skill, that he not only won acquittal, but emerged looking like a victim of jealous, small-minded men. His enemies seethed, their hatred crystallizing into something darker, more patient. They understood now that straightforward accusations wouldn't work. They needed something more devastating, something that would make defense impossible. I understand that patience now. I've felt it myself sitting in my office at 3 a.m, waiting for something I can't name, but know is coming. The first time it happened was 3 months into my research. I'd been reading trial transcripts all evening and fell asleep at my desk. When I woke, my neck stiff and my mouth dry, the clock showed 3 a.m. exactly, and I had the overwhelming sense that something had been standing behind my chair, reading over my shoulder, interested in what I was learning. Then came 1632, and Grandier made the mistake that would seal his fate. Cardinal Richelieu, the true power behind King Louis XIII's throne, ordered the walls and fortifications around Loudun demolished as part of his broader campaign to consolidate royal authority and eliminate potential centres of resistance. These walls weren't merely defensive structures. They represented autonomy, local power, the ability to resist central authority. Both Catholics and Protestants in Loudun united against their destruction, understanding that without those fortifications, they'd be vulnerable to the mercenary armies that roamed the French countryside like packs of wolves. Grandier became the voice of this resistance. He spoke eloquently about the king's previous promises to preserve Loudun's defences. He may have also written a satirical pamphlet mocking Richelieu's policies, though this was never definitively proven. The pamphlet was viciously funny, cutting, the kind of satire that powerful men never forgive. When Jean de Laubardemont, Richelieu's ruthless deputy and a man known for his cold efficiency in destroying the cardinal's enemies, arrived to supervise the demolition, Grandier blocked him using legal arguments and technical objections. Laubardemont returned to Paris humiliated. His mission failed, his reputation damaged. He was a man who'd built his career on ruthless competence, and this provincial priest had made him look foolish. Worse, Laubardemont had a personal connection to Loudun. He was a distant relative of Jeanne des Anges, the Mother Superior of the town's Ursuline convent. In that moment of humiliation, seeing his opportunity, Laubardemont began gathering every scrap of information about Urbain Grandier, building a dossier that would eventually be presented directly to Cardinal Richelieu. Grandier had made enemies of the two most powerful men in France. His fate was sealed, though he didn't know it yet. Just as my fate was sealed the first time I requested to see the original pact document in the archives at Poitiers, though I didn't realize it until months later when I woke to find my hand cramping from writing words in a language I'd never studied. September 1632. The Ursuline convent in Loudun housed 17 nuns in a building that was too small, too cold in winter, too hot in summer. These weren't daughters of nobility seeking refined religious education. Most came from provincial families of modest means, sent to the convent because marriage prospects were limited or family finances couldn't support them. They'd entered religious life not from burning vocation but from lack of alternatives, and that distinction would prove crucial to what came next. The Mother Superior was Jeanne des Anges, a woman in her early 30s, small and slight with a curved spine that gave her a hunched appearance. In portraits from before the possessions, she has intense dark eyes and a face that suggests intelligence struggling against frustration. According to research by Aldous Huxley, who wrote the definitive account of these events in his book The Devils of Loudun. Jeanne had become obsessed with Grandier, despite never having met him personally. She'd seen him from afar during religious processions, heard stories of his magnetic sermons and his scandalous love affairs, and begun fantasizing about him during her prayers. The fantasies started as simple thoughts, barely acknowledged. What would it be like to speak with him, to have him notice her, to be the object of the desire that he showed so freely to other women? But in the enclosed world of the convent, with its endless routines and crushing boredom, those thoughts metastasized into something more intense. She began imagining elaborate scenarios, conversations they might have, glances they might exchange. In her private prayers, she found herself thinking more about Grandier than about God. When the position of spiritual director for the convent opened, accounts differ sharply on what happened. Some sources claim Grandier was offered the position and declined, either because he was too busy with his other duties or because he sensed something troubling about the situation. Other accounts insist he eagerly applied, but was passed over in favour of Canon Jean Mignon, one of his bitter enemies and the nephew of the same Monsieur Trinquant, whose daughter Grandier had seduced. What's certain is that Jeanne d'Ange felt rejected, whether that rejection was real or imagined. And in the closed pressure cooker environment of that convent, rejection became obsession, and obsession became something far darker. It started with dreams. Jeanne began waking in the night claiming she'd seen a figure standing by her bed, a man in priestly robes who would vanish when she tried to focus on his face. Other nuns began reporting similar experiences. Sister Claire de Sazilly, young and impressionable, screamed one night that Father Mousseau, their deceased former director, had visited her bed and touched her in ways she couldn't speak about in daylight. The dream spread through the convent like contagion. Soon multiple nuns were experiencing nocturnal visitations, each more disturbing than the last. Then came the physical symptoms. It began with Sister Claire during evening prayers. She was reciting the rosary when her body suddenly went rigid. Her eyes rolled back. A sound emerged from her throat that didn't resemble any human voice, a guttural rasping that made the other nuns step back in fear. When the fit passed, Claire claimed she had no memory of what had happened. Within days, other nuns began exhibiting similar episodes. Convulsions, strange voices, violent thrashing that required multiple sisters to restrain them. The convent's new director, Canon Mignon, recognized an opportunity when he saw one. Here was a chance not only to build his own reputation as a holy exorcist, but to destroy his hated enemy, Grandier, in the process. By October 1632, he'd begun formal exorcisms, and he'd made a crucial decision. These would not be private, quiet affairs. They would be public spectacles. Word spread quickly through Loudun and the surrounding countryside. People travelled for miles to witness the possessed nuns of the Ursuline convent. The exorcisms took place in the convent's chapel, a small stone room with vaulted ceilings that amplified every sound. The nuns would be brought in, and under Mignon's questioning, they would convulse and writhe, foam gathering at the corners of their mouths, their bodies contorting in ways that seemed to defy natural flexibility. They spoke in voices that sounded nothing like their own, sometimes deep and masculine, sometimes high and shrieking, sometimes in what the exorcists claimed was Latin, though it was garbled and hard to understand. And when Mignon demanded to know who had sent these demons to torment innocent brides of Christ, the answer came back again and again. Urbain Grandier, the sorcerer Grandier, the priest who serves hell instead of heaven. Mother Jean's possessions were the most dramatic. She claimed to be inhabited by Asmodeus, a high-ranking demon associated with lust and revenge in occult literature. When Asmodeus spoke through her, her voice dropped to a masculine growl. She made obscene gestures, lifted her habit to expose herself, simulated sexual acts that made even the male witnesses look away in embarrassment. She described in graphic detail the rituals Grandier had supposedly performed to summon demons into the convent. Rituals involving black candles, inverted crosses, the desecration of the Eucharist. By October 11th, 3 nuns were officially declared possessed by a panel of local clergy. Father Pierre Bar, known for his aggressive approach to exorcism and his absolute certainty in the reality of demonic possession, arrived from a neighbouring parish to assist Mignon. Barra was a true believer in a way that made him dangerous. He saw demons everywhere and had a reputation for extracting confessions through a combination of leading questions and physical force during his exorcisms. The rituals became increasingly theatrical. The nuns would thrash and scream. They'd curse God in ways that horrified the watching crowds. They'd speak fragments of what sounded like different languages. One nun, Sister Agnes, began barking like a dog and claimed she was possessed by a canine demon. Another, Sister Louise, twisted her body backward until her head nearly touched her heels while shrieking that Grandier had promised her to Beelzebub as a bride. I've read the eyewitness accounts of these exorcisms dozens of times. What strikes me isn't just the descriptions of the nuns' behaviour, but the descriptions of the atmosphere in that chapel. Multiple witnesses mention feeling a pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. They describe sudden drops in temperature even though it was autumn, and the chapel should have been warm from the crowd. They mention shadows in corners that seemed to move independently of any light source. These details appear in accounts from believers and skeptics alike, which gives them an uncomfortable credibility. When I read these accounts late one night in my office, my wife walked in to tell me she was going to bed. She stopped in the doorway and asked if I was all right. I said yes, of course, why? She said my face looked strange, like I was smiling, but not in a happy way. I touched my face and realized my mouth had pulled into an expression I didn't consciously make. My reflection in the dark window showed something that didn't quite look like me. The smile was wrong, too wide, pulled up at the corners in a way that suggested amusement at something cruel. Grandier learned of the accusations in November 1632. His initial reaction was amusement bordering on disbelief. Demonic possession? In the 17th century, such accusations had destroyed many people, but Grandier's confidence in his own cleverness made him dismiss the threat. He'd defeated his enemies in court before. He'd do it again. He wrote a carefully worded letter to the Archbishop of Bordeaux, his ecclesiastical superior, requesting an official investigation into the claims. The Archbishop, a thoughtful man more interested in truth than spectacle, responded by sending a delegation of doctors, theologians, and medical experts to examine the nuns. Among them was a surgeon named Mannery, a practical man with little patience for supernatural explanations. Mannery observed the exorcisms with a clinical eye. He noted that the convulsions followed predictable patterns. The unknown languages were mostly gibberish, with occasional Latin words that any convent-educated nun would know. The contortions, while dramatic, were within the range of what a flexible young woman could achieve, especially if she'd been practicing. More tellingly, when he examined the nuns privately, away from the crowds and the exorcists, they showed no signs of possession. They were calm, articulate, normal. He reported his findings to the Archbishop, who was troubled by what appeared to be either fraud or mass hysteria. In January 1633, the Archbishop made a decisive move. He ordered the nuns separated and sequestered in different convents, breaking up the environment where the possessions fed off each other. The possessions immediately stopped. Within days of being separated, every single nun returned to normal behaviour. No convulsions, no demonic voices, no supernatural phenomena. It was such a complete and sudden cessation that even some of the exorcists began to doubt. For several months, it seemed the matter was resolved. Grandier had been vindicated, His enemies had overplayed their hand and been exposed, but Grandier underestimated the depth of the forces arrayed against him. While the possessions had stopped, Loudun had been in Paris, working carefully and quietly. He compiled a comprehensive dossier on Grandier, the accusations of sorcery, the failed exorcisms that resumed when the Archbishop's oversight ended, Grandier's obstruction of royal orders to demolish Loudun's walls, the satirical pamphlet mocking Richelieu, testimony from jealous clergy willing to swear to anything if it meant destroying their rival. Loudun had learned the key lesson of character assassination. You don't need truth, you just need enough allegations that the target can't possibly defend against them all. He arranged a private audience with Cardinal Richelieu and presented the dossier as evidence of a dangerous man who undermined royal authority, mocked the church's power, and consorted with demons. Richelieu, who never forgave slights and who saw, in Grandier's resistance to the wall, demolition, a broader threat to centralized power, gave Loudun everything he asked for. On November 30th, 1633, King Louis XIII signed a royal decree that essentially created a special court with one purpose: to investigate and prosecute Urbain Grandier. Loudun was appointed commissioner with powers that overrode normal legal procedures. He could select his own judges. He could prevent appeals to higher courts. He could arrest anyone who interfered with his investigation and charge them with treason. It was a legal framework designed to guarantee conviction, and everyone involved knew it. On December 7th, before dawn, Loudun's men surrounded the house where Grandier was sleeping. They arrested him in his nightclothes, clapped him in irons, and transported him under heavy guard to the prison at Angers, 20 miles away. The speed and severity of the arrest sent a clear message to Grandier's supporters. Anyone who helped him would face the full power of the state. The nuns were brought back to Loudun and reassembled at the convent. Within hours, the possessions resumed as if they'd never stopped, but now they were more violent, more obscene, more coordinated. Loudun spent weeks questioning the nuns separately, and the transcripts of these interrogations reveal a careful coaching process. He'd ask leading questions, suggest details, praise nuns who gave him useful testimony, and subtly threaten those who showed reluctance. Slowly, he shaped their individual stories into a coherent narrative of Grandier's guilt. From January through July of 1634, the exorcisms became the greatest show in France. Thousands travelled to Loudun, specifically to witness them. The town's inns were packed. Vendors sold food and drink to the crowds. Pickpockets worked the masses of spectators. It had the atmosphere of a festival, except the entertainment was supposed to be the literal battle between God and Satan for the souls of innocent women. Distinguished visitors came from across Europe. Princes, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, all granted special seats near the front where they could see every detail of the nuns' performances. And they were performances orchestrated and refined through repetition. The nuns knew what the crowds wanted: violence, sexuality, blasphemy, the thrill of watching holy women behave in unholy ways while claiming demonic compulsion. Mother Jean remained the star attraction. Her possession by Asmodeus had evolved into something like a theatrical character. She developed specific mannerisms for when the demon spoke through her: a particular growling voice, certain gestures and movements. She'd describe Grandier's alleged sabbats in elaborate detail: the black masses held at midnight in desecrated churches, the blood sacrifices, the sexual rituals, the pacts signed in fire and sealed with obscene kisses. The more outrageous her claims, the more the crowds gasped and whispered, and returned the next day for more. On June 23rd, 1634, Loudun orchestrated a piece of theatre designed to humiliate Grandier and demonstrate his guilt to any remaining doubters. Grandier was brought from his prison cell to the church of Sainte-Croix, still in chains, his face gaunt from months of imprisonment. The possessed nuns were already there, along with a massive crowd. Loudun announced that Grandier would perform an exorcism himself. If he was innocent, surely his priestly authority would cast out the demons. If he was guilty, the demons would refuse to obey him, and perhaps even reveal his true nature. It was a trap with no escape. Grandier understood this, but he had no choice. He was handed the ritual book and the holy water. As he began the Latin prayers of exorcism, his voice steady despite his circumstances, Mother Jeanne began to writhe on the floor before him, but she didn't respond to his commands to depart. Instead, the demon voice grew louder, more mocking. "You cannot command me, priest of Satan. You who called me forth, you who promised me these brides, command yourself back to the hell that spawned you." The other nuns joined in, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of accusation and blasphemy. They shrieked that Grandier was the sorcerer, the devil's servant, the corrupt priest who'd sold his soul for earthly pleasures. Their bodies contorted and twisted. One nun's back arched so severely that only her head and heels touched the floor. Another began foaming at the mouth, the foam tinged pink, as if mixed with blood. The crowd's mood shifted. These people had come uncertain, some sympathetic to Grandier, some merely curious. But watching him fail to command the demons, watching the nuns' violent reactions to his presence, doubt began to creep in. Maybe the accusations were true. Maybe this eloquent, charismatic priest really had made a pact with darkness. The atmosphere in that church shifted from curiosity to hostility, from spectacle to conviction. I've tried to imagine what Grandier felt in that moment, standing before people he'd served for years, watching them turn against him, knowing that no defense would matter because the verdict was already written. There's a detail in one witness account that haunts me. Grandier's hands were shaking as he held the ritual book, but his voice never wavered. He finished the entire exorcism, even though it clearly wasn't working, maintained his priestly dignity even as everything collapsed around him. That detail, more than any of the supernatural claims, more than the accusations of sorcery, that detail of a man maintaining composure in the face of overwhelming injustice, that's what got under my skin. Then came late July, and Loudun produced the evidence that would seal Grandier's fate forever. 2 documents, each more damning than the last. The first appeared to be in Grandier's own handwriting, though he would insist until his death that it was a forgery. It was a statement of renunciation, rejecting God, Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, all the saints, all the sacraments. It pledged eternal service to Lucifer, promised to do evil in the world, to corrupt the innocent, to lead souls to damnation. It was signed Urbain Grandier in what forensic analysts centuries later would confirm was a very skillful forgery, probably created by someone who'd studied Grandier's handwriting extensively. But the second document was something else entirely. When I first requested to see this document in the archives at Poitiers, the archivist asked if I was sure. She said most researchers found it disturbing, even though it was almost certainly a forgery. I assured her I'd seen plenty of historical documents. I had an academic distance from the material. I was wrong. The document is written backward in Latin, as if meant to be read in a mirror. The parchment itself feels wrong to the touch. Slightly oily, slightly warm, even though it's been stored in climate-controlled conditions for centuries. It's covered in symbols that don't match any standard grimoire or occult tradition. The prosecutors claimed it had been stolen from hell itself during one of Mother Jean's exorcisms, that the demon Asmodeus had been commanded to produce evidence of the pact and had physically manifested this document in a burst of sulphurous smoke. Let me read you the translation because the exact words matter. Every syllable carries weight. We, the influential Lucifer, the young Satan, Beelzebub, Leviathan, Elemi, and Astaroth, together with others, have today accepted the covenant pact of Urbain Grandier, who is ours, and him do we promise the love of women, the flower of virgins, the respect of monarchs, honours, lusts and powers. He will go whoring 3 days long, the carousal will be dear to him. He offers us once in the year a seal of blood. Under the feet he will trample the holy things of the church, and he will ask us many questions. With this pact he will live 20 years happy on the earth of men, and will later join us to sin against God, bound in hell in the council of demons. The document is signed by 6 entities: Lucifer, Beelzebub, Satan, Astaroth, Leviathan, and Elimi. Each signature is accompanied by a seal, a symbol unique to that demon. These aren't seals from any known grimoire. Scholars have searched, and these exact symbols appear nowhere else in occult literature. At the bottom, a final line: Baalberith, writer, identifying the demon who supposedly served as secretary to this infernal council. When I stood in that archive holding this document, I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was an interior cold, like ice forming in my bloodstream. The archivist had stepped back to give me privacy to examine it, but after about 5 minutes she approached and gently suggested I'd had enough time. She said I was making her uncomfortable, just standing there staring at it, not moving, barely breathing. I hadn't realised I'd been frozen in place. I'd completely lost track of time. That night I had the first clear dream. I was standing in a room I didn't recognise, a stone chamber, lit by black candles. There was a circle drawn on the floor in salt, and I was standing inside it. I was speaking words that tasted like copper in my mouth, words in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. And there was a presence outside the circle, something massive and patient, waiting for me to make a mistake, to step outside the protection, to invite it in. I woke at exactly 3 a.m, my mouth actually tasting of copper, my tongue slightly numb as if I'd been speaking for hours. The trial of Urbain Grandier began in August of 1634. The tribunal was composed entirely of judges selected by Loudun, men from Richelieu's territory who understood what verdict was expected of them. The legal framework was designed to prevent any possibility of acquittal. No appeals to higher courts were allowed. No witnesses favourable to Grandier were permitted to testify. Anyone who spoke in his defence risked being charged with obstruction of justice or even complicity in witchcraft. The possessed nuns were the star witnesses, but they didn't testify as themselves. When called to the stand and asked to identify themselves for the record, they gave demonic names. One by one, they approached the judges and spoke in their affected demonic voices. I am Asmodeus, prince of demons, commander of the legions of lust, and I testify that Urbain Grandier summoned me through forbidden rituals and bound me to his service. I am Beherit, Duke of Hell, and I came to this place at his calling, by his spells, through his pact with our master Lucifer. I am Leviathan, serpent of the abyss, and he promised us these holy virgins in exchange for earthly power and pleasure. 12 nuns possessed by 12 different demons, all telling the same story. Grandier was a sorcerer who'd made a pact with hell and sent demons to torment innocent brides of Christ. The testimony was coordinated, rehearsed, and utterly damning. When the documents were presented, the backward Latin pact and the renunciation, the judges examined them with expressions of horror and disgust. Grandier's defence was brilliant, despite the impossible circumstances. He argued that the possessions were fraudulent, pointing out how they'd stopped completely when the nuns were separated. He noted that the demons seemed to know only what the exorcist suggested to them, never providing information they couldn't have learned naturally. He demonstrated that the unknown languages were mostly gibberish, with occasional Latin words any educated nun would know. He argued that the documents were obvious forgeries, created by his enemies to destroy him. He was absolutely correct on every point, but it didn't matter. The verdict had been decided before the trial began, just as my course had been set the moment I requested that document from the archives, though I didn't understand that yet. I was still operating under the illusion that I was in control, that I was studying these events from a safe academic distance. On August 18th, 1634, the tribunal announced their verdict. Urbain Grandier was found guilty of the crime of sorcery, of making a pact with demons, of causing the possession of the Ursuline nuns through his malefic magic. The sentence was death by burning at the stake, but before the execution, before the purifying flames, there would be torture. The judges wanted a confession. They wanted names of accomplices. They wanted Grandier to admit his guilt before the entire town. The torture method was called the extraordinary question, and it was reserved exclusively for those already condemned to death because it was essentially a slow execution in itself. Grandier's legs were placed in the brodequins, the Spanish boot. These were iron frames that enclosed the lower leg from knee to ankle. Wooden wedges would be driven between the iron and the leg, crushing the flesh and shattering the bones progressively. The torture began at 9 in the morning and continued for hours. 4 wedges, 6, 8. Each time a wedge was driven in, Grandier's screams echoed through the prison. His legs swelled grotesquely. Blood seeped between the iron plates. The bones splintered with sounds witnesses described as similar to green wood breaking. By the time they finished, both legs were completely destroyed. The bones shattered into fragments, the flesh pulped and bleeding. Through all of this, Grandier never confessed. He never named accomplices because there were no accomplices. He never admitted to witchcraft because he hadn't practiced witchcraft. He maintained his innocence even as his body was systematically destroyed, even as the pain must have been beyond anything we can imagine. The interrogators became frustrated, then angry. How could he endure this without breaking? What kind of man had this strength? Maybe it was pride keeping him silent, the same pride that had led him to seduce his friend's daughter and mock Cardinal Richelieu. Maybe it was integrity, a final stand for truth in the face of overwhelming injustice. Or maybe, and this is what haunts me, maybe he'd learned something in those months of imprisonment and torture. Maybe he'd come to understand that there are worse things than death, worse things than pain. Maybe he'd glimpsed what I would eventually glimpse, standing in that archive holding that impossible document. Late afternoon on August 18th, they carried Grandier to the public square at Sainte-Croix. His legs couldn't support him, the bones were too damaged, so they loaded him onto a cart like cargo. Thousands of people had gathered to watch. The execution of a sorcerer priest who'd made a pact with demons was the spectacle of the century. Vendors moved through the crowd, selling meat pies and wine. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. It had the atmosphere of a festival. The sentence required certain formalities first. Grandier had to be taken to the doors of Saint-Pierre-du-Marche and Sainte-Croix churches, the parishes he'd served. At each he was required to kneel, a rope around his neck, holding a 2-pound burning candle, and ask forgiveness from God, the King, and justice. With his shattered legs, kneeling was agony, but he did it. His voice, weakened by hours of screaming during torture, still carried enough to be heard by the watching crowds. Then they brought him to the stake that had been erected in the centre of the square. It was surrounded by bundles of wood and straw, arranged to burn slowly rather than quickly. A slow burn meant more suffering, a more complete purification. They tied him to the post, his destroyed legs dangling uselessly. A Capuchin friar, Father Grilot, approached with a crucifix and offered him one final chance at mercy. If he confessed his sins now, they would strangle him before lighting the fire. sparing him the agony of burning alive. Grandier looked at the crucifix. According to multiple witness accounts, he kissed it gently and spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear. The exact words are disputed. Some witnesses claimed he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do," echoing Christ's words on the cross. Others swore he said something different. "I commend my soul to God, though you deliver my body to devils. Let him judge between us." Father Grillo, disturbed by Grandier's continued defiance, stepped back and gave the signal. The executioners lit the fire. The wood was green and damp, designed to burn slowly with lots of smoke. The flames climbed gradually and the crowd fell silent, watching. Multiple witnesses recorded what happened next, and their accounts are remarkably consistent. As the smoke thickened around Grandier, an enormous fly appeared, buzzing loudly enough to be heard over the crackling flames. It circled Grandier's head again and again, moving through the smoke in ways that defied the air currents. It landed on his face, crawled across his lips, then took flight again. The crowd began murmuring. Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies in Hebrew. Was this the demon come to collect his servant? Or was it the demon's final mockery, a visible sign of the pact? The fly continued its circles as Grandier's hair caught fire, as his clothes began to burn, as he started screaming. His screams were terrible, witnesses said, not just from pain, but from something else, something deeper. One person described it as the sound of a soul being torn from a body against its will. Another said it sounded like a man seeing something he'd never imagined, something so terrible that pain became secondary to horror. The fly disappeared the exact moment Grandier stopped screaming. One witness swore he saw it fly directly into Grandier's mouth just as he took his final breath. Others said it simply vanished into the smoke. But everyone agreed on the timing. The moment Grandier died, the fly was gone. His body burned for another 2 hours until nothing remained but ash and fragments of bone. The executioners scattered the ashes to prevent any relics being collected. It was finished. Urbain Grandier was dead, destroyed so completely that nothing physical remained. His enemies had won the ultimate victory. Except the possessions didn't end. Everyone assumed that with the sorcerer dead, the demons would depart. The exorcists prepared for a final triumphant ceremony where the demons would be expelled and the nuns restored to normal. Instead, the possessions grew worse, more violent, more obscene, more impossible to explain away. For 2 more years, the nuns of Loudun convulsed and blasphemed. If anything, the demonic manifestations intensified. Mother Jean claimed to be possessed by 7 demons, now instead of just Asmodeus. Her contortions became more extreme. During one exorcism, her body bent backwards so severely that her spine made cracking sounds the audience could hear. She claimed the demons were angry that their servant had been martyred, that they would take vengeance on Loudun. Then, the exorcists themselves began to fall. Father Tranquille, who had been one of the most aggressive interrogators of Grandier and had testified passionately at the trial about the reality of the possessions, started exhibiting symptoms. It began with headaches and disturbed sleep. Then came the voices, whispers in languages he didn't know. Then his body began moving without his command, performing obscene gestures during Mass, speaking blasphemies when he tried to pray. By 1637, Father Tranquille was fully possessed. The irony was lost on no one. The exorcist had become the possessed. His symptoms matched exactly what he described in the nuns. Convulsions, strange voices, violent aversion to holy objects. He spent the last year of his life in torment, claiming that demons were tearing at his soul, that they laughed at him for his role in destroying an innocent man. Before he died in 1638, he wrote a letter to his religious superior. I found this letter in the archives of his order, and it's never been made public. Let me read you what he wrote. The thing that speaks through me is not a demon of hell as we understand it. It is older than hell, older than the fall of Lucifer, older than the creation of mankind. It was waiting in the spaces between faith and doubt, between truth and lies, between righteousness and sin. We gave it form and name when we condemned an innocent man using the language of the sacred. We opened a door that should have remained sealed forever. We thought we were fighting evil, but we became the evil we claimed to fight. Grandier was never the one who made a pact with darkness. We did, all of us. Every person who chose convenient lies over uncomfortable truth. Every person who dressed their hatred in holy words. Every person who watched an innocent man burn and called it justice. The pact is not between man and devil. It is between mankind and our own infinite capacity for evil when we convince ourselves we're doing good. And once made, such pacts cannot be broken. They endure, they spread, they consume. I am consumed now, and I understand too late that we did not cast out demons from Loudun. We invited them in. We gave them permission. We signed our names in the blood of an innocent man, and the covenant will endure long after we are all dust. Father Tranquille died 3 days after writing that letter, his body twisted into a position that should have been anatomically impossible, his face frozen in an expression that witnesses described as absolute terror mixed with understanding, as if he'd finally seen something clearly, but wished he hadn't. The Jesuit mystic Jean-Joseph Surin was sent to Loudun in 1634 to replace Tranquille and finish the exorcisms. Surin was considered one of the most spiritually powerful priests in France, a man of genuine faith and mystical insight. If anyone could end the possessions, it would be him. He arrived confident, assured of God's protection. Within 3 months, he was writing letters describing battles with entities he couldn't name, presences he couldn't see but could feel pressing against his mind. Within a year, Surin had succumbed completely. He spent the next 20 years in a state that doctors called madness, but that he described as invasion. Sometimes he was lucid himself, able to write and speak normally. Other times something else spoke through his mouth using his voice, but with a different cadence, a different personality. He wrote extensively about his experiences, describing how it felt to have something else inside his consciousness, something that knew his thoughts before he thought them, that could puppet his body while he screamed silently inside his own mind. He didn't fully recover until 1657, more than 20 years after going to Loudun. Even then, he was never quite the same. In his later writings, he suggested that what happened in Loudun wasn't demonic possession in the traditional sense. It was something else, something he struggled to articulate. He wrote about how collective belief can create reality, how shared madness can become indistinguishable from supernatural intervention, how the line between psychological and spiritual isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Mother Jeanne d'Ange continued her possessions until 1636, performing for crowds that never diminished in size. Then, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of witnesses, the demons supposedly departed in a visible manifestation. There was a burst of smoke, a terrible smell, and Jeanne collapsed unconscious. When she woke, she claimed to be freed. She lived until 1665, eventually writing extensive memoirs about her experiences. In these writings, she insisted everything had been real, that she had been genuinely possessed, that Urbain Grandier truly was a sorcerer who'd summoned demons to torment her. But there are moments in her memoirs where the certainty wavers. She describes dreams where Grandier appeared to her, not as the demonic sorcerer, but as a man, just a man, flawed and proud, but human. In these dreams, he would ask her why, Why did you destroy me? What did I do to deserve this? She'd wake from these dreams weeping, though she could never articulate why. Reading her memoirs late at night in my office, I found myself sympathizing with her in a way I didn't expect. She was trapped too, in her own way. Once, she'd committed to the role of possessed nun. Once she'd made those first accusations, there was no way back. Admitting fraud would mean admitting she'd participated in murdering an innocent man. So, she had to keep insisting it was real, had to keep building the story, had to keep performing until the performance became her reality. That's when my own experiences began to intensify. I'd been researching for about 18 months at this point, spending 12 to 14 hours a day immersed in trial transcripts, witness statements, theological treatises on demonic possession. My wife complained that I was distant, obsessed, that I talked in my sleep using words she didn't understand. I brushed off her concerns. I was making breakthrough discoveries in my research. I was uncovering details other historians had missed. I was close to something important. The dreams became more frequent and more vivid. Always the same stone chamber, the same circle of salt, the same words tasting of copper. But now I could see more details. The walls were covered in writing, the same backward Latin from the pact document. The presence outside the circle had a shape now. Vaguely human, but wrong in proportions, too tall, limbs too long, face always in shadow. And it was speaking to me, not in words I could hear, but in thoughts that appeared in my mind fully formed. It was offering me things, understanding, knowledge, the truth behind every mystery in history, the ability to see through the veils that separate natural from supernatural, power over the forces that most people don't even believe exist. All I had to do was step outside the circle, just one step, and everything I wanted to know would be revealed. I started waking at 3 a.m. every single night without exception. The moment I woke, I'd feel it. The presence in my room, standing in the corner, where the shadows were deepest. My rational mind knew this was psychological, a manifestation of stress and obsession, but knowing that didn't make it feel less real. I could sense its attention on me, patient and curious, like an entomologist studying an interesting insect. Then I started finding the journal entries. I keep a research journal, always have, documenting my findings and thoughts. I'd leave it on my desk when I went to sleep, and when I woke at 3 a.m, there would be new entries. Pages of text in handwriting that looked like mine but was subtly wrong. The letters formed at strange angles, the pressure of the pen uneven. At first I thought I must be sleepwalking, writing in a fugue state. My wife suggested I see a doctor. I made an appointment but cancelled it. I told myself I was fine. The content of the entries made no sense initially. Seemingly random Latin words, fragments of phrases, diagrams of symbols I didn't recognize. I took them to my colleague, Dr. Marie Lavelle, who specializes in medieval Latin and paleography, asking her to translate without telling her where the text came from. She worked on it for 2 days, and when I returned to her office, her face was pale. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "I need you to translate it first." "Philippe, where did you find this text? This is important." I insisted. She tell me what it said. She looked at the pages like they might catch fire, then read slowly. "The pact endures. The names change, but the covenant remains. What was promised must be delivered. Blood calls to blood across the centuries. The seal is unbroken. He who studies the pact becomes part of the pact. Understanding is consent. Knowledge is invitation. The door is opening." I felt the blood drain from my face. Marie was watching me closely. "This is your handwriting," she said quietly. "Philippe, did you write this?" "I don't remember writing it." "That's not an answer." I left without explaining further. That night, I tried to stay awake, determined to catch myself if I got up to write. I sat at my desk, lights on, coffee in hand, eyes on the blank journal pages. Around 2:45 a.m, I felt an overwhelming drowsiness. My eyes were closing despite my best efforts. I snapped them open repeatedly, but the pull was irresistible. I don't remember my eyes closing for the last time. I woke with my hand cramping, my fingers locked around a pen, my arm aching from extended writing. The clock showed 3:47 a.m. The journal was open and 3 pages were filled with text. My handwriting, but I had no memory of writing any of it. I read what I'd written. I understand now. The pact at Loudun was never broken because it was never truly Grandier's pact. It was collective. Everyone who participated in the lie, everyone who chose to believe the convenient fiction rather than the difficult truth, everyone who watched and did nothing, they all signed it. Their signatures are written in Grandier's blood and sealed with his ashes. The document in the archives is just a shadow, a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. It persists because the pact persists. Evil justified as righteousness, lies dressed as holy truth, murder performed as divine service. This is the eternal human pact with darkness. It renews itself every generation, every time we choose comfortable evil over uncomfortable good. I am part of it now. I have been since I first touched that document. Understanding creates connection. Study creates participation. Knowledge is complicity. The door is not closed. The door has never been closed. I have been invited, and I have accepted by virtue of my curiosity, my arrogance, my certainty, that I could study this without being touched by it. I was wrong. Grandier was wrong. Surin was wrong. We are all wrong when we believe we can touch darkness and remain clean. I tried to stop researching. I boxed up all my materials, returned books to the library, avoided the university archive. I told my department chair I needed a break, cited stress and personal issues. For 3 months I didn't touch anything related to Loudun or Grandier or demonic possession. The dreams stopped. The 3 a.m. wakings ceased. The journal entries didn't appear. I started sleeping through the night. My wife was relieved, thought I was recovering. I thought so too, but I couldn't let it go. There were questions I needed answered. There was one detail that bothered me, that made all the difference between historical curiosity and something far more troubling. I needed to know about the ink. The forensic analysis of the pact document had noted that the ink used for the demonic signatures was different from the ink used for the main text. I'd initially dismissed this as contamination or testing error, but something Marie said when she translated my journal entries stuck with me. Blood calls to blood across the centuries. I tracked down the forensic expert who'd analysed the pact document, Dr. Amélie Moreau, a specialist in historical documents and materials analysis. She was reluctant to discuss the case, said she'd submitted her report years ago and moved on to other projects, but I pressed her, and finally she agreed to meet me at a cafe near the Bibliothèque Nationale. She arrived looking uncomfortable, ordering coffee she didn't drink. "Why are you asking about this now?" she said. "That analysis was done 5 years ago." "I need to know about the ink. Your report said the demonic signatures used different ink." "What did you mean?" She looked around the cafe as if checking whether anyone was listening. "I probably shouldn't have included that detail in the report. It was anomalous." "What do you mean anomalous?" "The ink used for the main text is standard iron gall ink from the 17th century. We can date it, trace it, understand its composition. The ink for the signatures..." She trailed off, stirring her coffee absently. "Dr. Moreau, please." "It shouldn't exist. The chemical composition doesn't match anything from the 17th century or any century after. There are organic compounds I couldn't identify. I sent samples to 3 different laboratories, including one that specializes in unknown substances. All three came back with the same conclusion. The composition is unlike any known ink. Could it be a modern forgery? Someone added the signatures later. No, the parchment age testing is consistent throughout. The ink soaked into the parchment fibers in a way that takes centuries. Whatever that ink is, it was applied around the same time as the rest of the document. But Philippe, she leaned forward, lowering her voice. One of the labs did a spectrographic analysis. They found proteins in the ink. Human proteins. Blood proteins specifically, but with anomalies they couldn't explain. The structure was wrong somehow. Blood? My mouth went dry. Heavily degraded, mixed with other compounds we couldn't identify. But yes, human blood is definitely a component of that ink. The lab director called me personally to ask where I'd gotten the sample. She wanted to know if it was from a crime scene. I had to explain it was from a 17th century document, which just confused her more. She said blood doesn't preserve that way, that the proteins should have degraded completely. But they haven't. They're still there, still detectable, still somehow. She struggled for the word. Active, that was her term. She said the proteins showed unusual electrical activity under testing, as if they were somehow still alive, which is impossible. I felt cold spreading through my chest, the same cold I'd felt holding the document. Did you include this in your report? I mentioned the anomalous ink composition. I didn't include the speculation about blood or the electrical activity. It would have sounded insane. I'd have lost all credibility. I just noted it was inconsistent with known historical inks and recommended further study. No one followed up, to be honest. I was relieved. Why? She looked at me directly for the first time. Because every time I worked with that document, I had nightmares. Every single night. I'd dream I was in a dark room and something was trying to communicate with me, to show me things I didn't want to see. The dream stopped 2 weeks after I submitted my report and never touched the document again. I don't know what that parchment is, Philippe, but it's not just a historical artifact. There's something wrong with it on a level I can't articulate. My advice? Leave it alone. Write your dissertation about something else. Don't do what I did and convince yourself you're rational enough to handle it. But I couldn't leave it alone. That's the thing about obsession, about the kind of curiosity that drives people to look into things that should remain hidden. You tell yourself you're strong enough, smart enough, protected by rationality and academic distance. You tell yourself that understanding something means controlling it. You're always wrong. I went back to the archives. I requested the pact document again. The same archivist who'd supervised my viewing before looked at the request form and then looked at me. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You seem unwell, if you don't mind me saying." "I'm fine. I just need to see it one more time." She brought it out, handling it with gloves and clear reluctance. I stood at the examination table under the harsh fluorescent lights and looked at it again. The backward Latin text, the impossible symbols, the 6 signatures of demons, each with its unique seal. And now, knowing what I knew about the ink, I looked at those signatures differently. They were written in blood. Human blood mixed with something else, something that had kept those proteins alive for 400 years. Whose blood? The obvious answer was Grandier's, that his blood had been used to forge the signatures after his torture, but the document had been produced at his trial before the torture. So, whose blood? I stared at those signatures, and for just a moment they seemed to move. Not obviously, not in a way I could point to, but a shifting at the edge of perception, like looking at something in peripheral vision that changes when you focus on it directly. I leaned closer, and my vision blurred slightly. The symbols seemed to have depth suddenly, as if they were windows into somewhere else, somewhere dark and vast. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back." The archivist's voice seemed to come from far away. "Sir, Can you hear me? I realized I'd been standing frozen, face inches from the document, for several minutes. I straightened up, and the room swayed. The archivist was looking at me with concern, bordering on alarm. I think that's enough for today, she said firmly. She closed the document case and took it away before I could protest. That night, the dreams returned with an intensity that was qualitatively different from before. I was in the stone chamber again, but now I could see what was outside the circle. 6 figures stood in the shadows beyond the salt line. Impossibly tall, their features hidden, but their presence overwhelming. They weren't speaking, but I could feel their thoughts pressing against my mind like physical pressure. They showed me things, visions, memories, possibilities. I saw Grandier's trial from his perspective, felt his growing understanding that no defense would save him, felt his terror transmuting into something else, a kind of desperate hope that his suffering might mean something. I saw Mother Jeanne, alone in her cell, wrestling with what she'd set in motion, wanting to stop but unable to see how without destroying herself. I saw Laubardemont writing reports to Richelieu, justifying murder with bureaucratic efficiency, never once questioning whether he was doing right, only whether he was doing it effectively. I saw Father Tranquille's final moments, his body twisted and broken, his mind fragmenting as something else crowded in. I saw Seurin's 20 years of invasion, the daily battle for control of his own thoughts. I saw the crowds at Grandier's execution, their faces hungry for spectacle, for violence dressed as justice, for the thrill of watching a man burn. And I saw myself standing in an archive 400 years later, touching a document that should never have been preserved, linking myself to a chain of suffering and evil that stretched across centuries. I saw my future, branches of possibility splitting and recombining. In most of them I went mad. In some I heard people I loved. In a few I understood too much and couldn't bear continuing to exist with that knowledge. I woke at 3 a.m. screaming. My wife wasn't in bed. I found her in the living room, already dressed, a suitcase by the door. She was crying. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "You've been talking in your sleep for weeks. Not French, not English, something else. Last night you sat up, looked right at me, and smiled. But it wasn't you, Philippe. It wasn't your smile. I don't know what's happening to you, but I can't watch it anymore. I'm going to stay with my sister." "Wait, please, I can explain." "Explain what? That you're obsessed with a 400-year-old witchcraft trial? That you've lost 20 pounds and barely sleep? That you write in journals you don't remember writing? I read some of those entries, Philippe. I know I shouldn't have, but I was worried. The things you wrote," she shook her head. "I think you need help, professional help. But I can't be here while you decide whether to get it." She left. The apartment felt enormous and empty. I sat in the living room as dawn broke, and I made a decision. I would end this. I would seal all my research, walk away completely, never touch anything related to Loudun or Grandier again. It was the only way to stop what was happening to me. I spent the next week packaging everything. Every book, every photocopy, every note, every journal entry. I put it all in archive boxes and took them to the university storage facility. I filled out the paperwork restricting access for 50 years. Maybe by then someone else could look at this material objectively, without falling into the trap that caught me. Or maybe whoever opened those boxes would experience the same thing, would feel the same cold seeping into their bones, would wake at 3 a.m. to presences in the dark. I thought that would be the end. I thought I could walk away clean. But 2 nights after sealing the archives, I woke at 3 a.m. to find myself sitting at my desk, pen in hand, journal open. I had no memory of getting out of bed. I looked down at what I'd written. The documents are sealed, but the door remains open. Physical separation means nothing. The connection is established. Understanding creates bond. Knowledge creates obligation. I've been studying the pact, but the pact has also been studying me. It knows me now, knows my thoughts, my fears, my weaknesses. It knows what I want. To understand, to know, to see behind the veils. It can give me this. All I have to do is accept. All I have to do is step outside the circle. Below this, I'd drawn something. The 6 demonic seals from the pact document, reproduced perfectly from memory. In the center, I'd written my own name. I understood then what Father Tranquille had understood, what Jean-Joseph Sourin had learned during his 20 years of invasion. The pact at Loudun wasn't just a historical event. It was a template, a door, a mechanism that persists because the forces that created it persist. Human pride, human fear, human willingness to commit evil while believing we're doing good. These don't change across centuries. They create the same openings, the same opportunities for something else to enter. Grandier made a pact with his own arrogance, believing he was untouchable. His enemies made a pact with their righteous hatred, convincing themselves that destroying him was God's work. The nuns made a pact with their desperation for meaning in suffocating lives. The crowds made a pact with their hunger for spectacle and violence. Every person involved signed in their own way, though only Grandier's name appeared on the document. And I had signed too, the moment I decided that understanding this case mattered more than caution, more than the warnings I'd received, more than my own well-being. I'd signed with my obsession, with my arrogant belief that I was rational enough to study evil without being touched by it. The pact endures because we keep signing it. Different names, different circumstances, but the same fundamental bargain. I will do what I want, believe what's convenient, ignore warnings and consequences, and convince myself I'm justified. That's the real pact. Not a contract with literal demons, but a contract with the worst parts of human nature, the parts we dress in righteous language and holy justifications. I'm writing this now as a warning, though I don't know if warnings ever work. The documents about the Loudun possessions are public record. Anyone can research this case. Anyone can request to see that pact document in the Bibliothèque Nationale. The archivist will bring it out and you'll stand there under fluorescent lights looking at 400-year-old parchment covered in backward Latin and impossible symbols. And maybe you'll feel nothing. Maybe you'll examine it with pure academic interest and leave unchanged. But maybe you'll feel what I felt, that creeping cold, that sense of presence, that pull toward understanding that becomes invitation. Maybe you'll start waking at 3 a.m. Maybe you'll find yourself writing things you don't remember. Maybe you'll discover that some knowledge comes with obligations you didn't agree to but can't refuse. I don't know if what happened to me is supernatural in the traditional sense. I don't know if there are literal demons waiting in the dark, or if the darkness is something we create ourselves through our choices, our hatreds, our desperate needs. In the end, I'm not sure the distinction matters. The result is the same. People get destroyed, souls get corrupted, evil gets perpetuated under the banner of righteousness. Urbain Grandier died proclaiming his innocence, and almost certainly he was innocent of the specific charges. But he wasn't innocent of pride, of believing he could seduce and discard and mock without consequence. His enemies weren't innocent either. They became the evil they claimed to fight, destroyed a man using God's name, tortured and murdered, while convinced they were holy. The nuns weren't innocent, trading truth for attention and power. The crowds weren't innocent, entertained by suffering dressed as justice. Nobody was innocent. That's what makes the Loudun possession so terrifying. It wasn't monsters doing monstrous things. It was ordinary people. People like you and me, making small choices that accumulated into something unspeakable. Choosing convenient lies over difficult truths. Choosing comfortable hatred over uncomfortable empathy. choosing righteous revenge over merciful restraint. And 400 years later, I made my own choices. To pursue understanding at any cost. To ignore warnings. To believe I was special, different, protected by rationality. I signed the same pact every person in Loudun signed, just in my own way. I still wake at 3 a.m. I still feel the presence in the corner of my room. My hand still writes things I don't remember, but I've learned to live with it because I have no choice. You can't unsign a pact once you've made it. You can't unknow what you've learned. You can't close a door you didn't realize you'd opened. The pact endures. The names change. The covenant remains, written in blood that somehow stays active across centuries, signed by demons that might be literal entities, or might be the darkest aspects of human nature given form and name, witnessed by everyone who touches it, studies it, becomes fascinated by it. I've told you the story of Urbain Grandier, but really I've told you the story of myself, how an academic historian became part of the very history he was studying, how understanding became participation, how distance collapsed into connection. Some prices are too high. Some knowledge costs more than it's worth. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I learned this too late, but maybe you won't. Maybe you'll hear this story and recognize the warning signs. The creeping cold, the 3 a.m. wakings, the sense of presence in the dark, the pull toward understanding that masks invitation. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll think I'm simply someone who spent too long studying traumatic historical events and suffered a psychological breakdown. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's all in my head, neurons misfiring, trauma creating the illusion of supernatural intervention. But explain the ink to me. Explain how blood proteins stay electrically active for 400 years. Explain how I can reproduce complex symbols I've only seen once from memory. Explain how I write fluent medieval Latin in my sleep when I barely passed my Latin requirement in seminary. Explain the fly at Grandier's execution, witnessed by hundreds, appearing the moment he started to burn, disappearing the moment he died. Explain how exorcists went mad, studying the possessions they claimed to be fighting. Explain how this pattern repeats. Study leads to obsession. Obsession leads to invasion. Invasion leads to destruction. I can't explain any of it. All I know is that I touched something I shouldn't have touched, looked at something I shouldn't have looked at, and now I'm marked, connected, part of a covenant that stretches across 4 centuries and will continue long after I'm gone. The documents are sealed, the research is locked away, but the pact endures, because the pact isn't in the documents. It's in us, in our pride, our fear, our desperate hunger for meaning and power and understanding, in our willingness to destroy others while convincing ourselves we're righteous, in our certainty that we're different, special, protected from consequences that affect lesser people. Urbain Grandier believed he was special. So did his enemies. So did I. We were all wrong. We all burned in our own ways. Something is always listening. Something is always waiting. Something is always ready to give you exactly what you think you want. Call it demons. Call it psychology. Call it the accumulated weight of human evil seeking new vessels. The name doesn't matter. What matters is the price. And the price is always, always higher than you imagine. The price is always, always your soul, whether you believe in souls or not. I paid it. Grandier paid it. Everyone involved in Loudun paid it. And you'll pay it too if you ignore this warning, if you convince yourself you're different, if you believe you can touch darkness and remain clean. The pact endures. The door remains open, and I'm still writing in my journal at 3 a.m, words I won't remember, in a language that tastes like copper and blood. The names change, but the covenant remains the same.